Hello.
Hi.
Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Hey, Sana.
Hi, is Kaushik here?
Indeed, I'm here.
Perfect.
Should we start at 3 minutes?
Kaushik, I think we should start.
Okay, you want to kick it off, Sana?
Sure. This particular SIG meeting, hello everyone. This particular SIG meeting is specially dedicated to preparation for our R2 requirements. And in that effect, Kaushik has put together a document which we will share in a minute. I had also requested for your comments and suggestions in the previous requirements document, and some people have gathered some feedback on that document as well. Any other questions, any other comments from the group here? Are we good to proceed on that plan?
I guess so. Silence is
Right.
golden.
Yes, that's right. So Kaushik, I think I just wanted a 5 minutes recap on either of the two documents. I think we have captured the R1 R1 release details a little bit. If we can go through that, and if we can just look at the R1 release requirements, if they're captured correctly, and then we can move on to our R2 discussion.
Okay, and this is the R1 user stories and scope document.
So the previous requirements document that we were gathering for feedback, I made a section for R1 in that same document. I just wanted to see if the details are captured correctly, if Wim or Tal could look at that and make sure we are on the same page with everyone.
Can we share the document on the screen maybe? Or?
Yes, I was trying to find document. Give me 1 second.
Nephew automation or something, right?
Requirements, yeah, the automation requirements.
I'll pull it up 1 sec.
Okay, awesome.
Share screen. This one, and you had a R1 section, you said, right?
Right, just we scroll down a little.
R1.
So I got this writing from the release approval slide deck, and I think most of the things that we were targeting to complete were stretch goals at that stage. But at the end, I found out that everything was completed, so that was a yes in front of it. I think one of you who has the details can actually ensure that this information is correct.
Yeah. Now I think yeah. So sorry, I should raise my hand.
Go ahead.
Can I?
Go ahead, Wim.
So I think I saw some comments from Eric, for example, right? Is that I think we do these things. I mean, we didn't do horizontal scaling by okay, yeah. So we can deploy a new UPF on a new cluster, right? So that is okay. But I think what you see is that not all the lifecycle operations of a network function are covered in release 1. I think that's one of the comments also, I think, which comes from Eric, I see in some of the documents.
Yeah.
So it's actually very basic what we do in R1. So we can deploy, we can change the capacity. The result of a capacity change, now this is related towards free 5GC, is that it restarts the network function. But it's related to free 5GC. So, but there is lots of, let's say, lifecycle operations that are not covered. Also, for example, there are some parameters that are hard-coded in that journey, if you will.
Right.
Like we are
Wim, a quick
using...
question. Yeah,
Yeah.
I want you to continue. I really like you to go through this. Just a quick question. Is there any document that you guys have created on the release details? I was maybe thinking of looking at that offline, just to basically streamline the content here.
I don't think we have produced it, but we could produce it if you want. Is, for example, what
This could be your working space if you would like to. I mean, let's go through this with you right now, and then offline, if you guys want to tweak the details here, this could be the true reflection of what was accomplished in R1, and you can take it elsewhere to like wherever you want to publish it after.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's probably a good idea to document what is covered and what is not covered, right? Or at least identify the parts that are not covered, right? So
exactly.
Yeah, so but we can do that. But yeah, so in a nutshell, so we can deploy a network function with a set of parameters. Some parameters, and I would say it's mainly the 3GPP parameters, are hard-coded at the moment. So for example, like we are using slice identifiers and stuff like that, like tracking area groups and stuff like that, or indicators.
Yeah, even PLMNs are hard-coded.
Yeah, PLMN ID and so on. Yeah.
Yeah, so there's a bunch of stuff that is basically hard-coded. And then, yeah, so if you look at the lifecycle operation elements, the only thing that we did is we basically, you can change the capacity, and the result of the capacity change is basically, now this is related to how free 5GC works, but we restart the network function basically, and you get a new capacity, but yeah, that's what you'll get. And so that's kind of basically what is here is right, but I think the question is what is under each of these bullets. So I always, the devil's in the detail, right? And I don't know whether other people have other comments, but
yeah, I think yes, I think there are also other missing points. Typically, what you did to facilitate all this networking between the various clusters, I think it's very very interesting and brings a lot of value for automation. And I think it's not well described today, but
yeah.
maybe
I'm in the process
also...
of document. Yeah, I'm in the process of documenting that, Eric. So that will be covered, right? But yeah. So I'm documenting that as we speak. Actually, I was hoping to finish it last week, but I didn't. But I will do it probably not this week because I'm traveling. But next week I'll be finished with that. But yeah, so that's kind of a little bit what you see here. So in other words, I mean, for me, the long story is that what we delivered in R1 is actually captured here. But if you look into the details, it's very basic and very minimal, if you will. If I would to say what an operator does with respect to lifecycle operations on network functions, I think it's very basic. Yeah. So I think Tal has his hand raised. seems, I think.
Yeah, I just wanted to agree and add a detail. Right, I can say that these are all green. We did do them, but in many cases it's pretty superficial, which was expected, by the way. I don't think that's a huge shock. I will say that in terms of LCM for Free 5GC, we have not really reached the limits of what we can do with Free 5GC. There's definitely more scenarios we can and should cover as use cases, but Free 5GC has limits in terms of what it will be able to let us do as well. It is, as we know, it's not a production grade piece of software. To be technical about it, Free 5GC works, you have a configuration file. When you start the program, it reads the configuration file and that's its configuration. If you need to change the configuration, you need to restart the pod. It starts pretty quickly, but you know, this is not a production grade a network function which can be configured while running, right? After it is stood up using netconf or other protocols. So LCM will always be somewhat limited, but it's still an important use case to show how we can do certain day two operations using that. But I really hope that beyond R2, we will start seeing other network functions and pieces of software that we can demonstrate a deeper version of LCM than we can do right now.
Yeah. Should we maybe
So I have a quick question there. So I'm trying to basically wrap my head around what exactly was accomplished in R1. And I know that we can refine the document after we are in the discussion mode right now. So for the UPF and SMF, we are trying to configure the infrastructure as a prep. Then we deploy UPF and SMF. And we are also doing some degree of configurations on those functions. And there is a minimal lifecycle management accomplished on that on the free 5GC UPF SMF two network functions, right? On a very high level.
Well,
yes,
enough configurations that we can make a call, so it's not minimum. So
okay,
so also
excellent.
AMF. So we did AMF, UPF,
so Sana,
and
just to give you an idea, if you would in TELUS, right, you have your own MNC MCT, for example, you will not be able to configure that.
Okay.
You see? So in other words, what I'm saying with the hard-coded parameter is that, for example, in the radio, you have tracking areas, right? So normally, as a customer, you probably want to say, okay, for my network, I have these tracking areas. This is my MNC, MCC code. These are my, let's say, slice identifier that you use into your network and stuff like that. So all these parameters at the moment in the current scope are hard-coded. So that means if you set up two times the R1 release, these parameters will always be the same. There is no way at the moment you can change that.
Then how were you able to make the call?
So because we kind of took a set of parameters that were in, so basically we took the parameters that Orange used for their scenario, and we kind of hard-coded those numbers. We took the same thing.
So the UE run sim takes the same configuration, so they agree.
Okay, awesome. You copied that into your UE. Perfect. And simulated that so that you can reflect that, and then you're able to successfully make a call.
Yes.
But also, Sana, maybe something what is also important for me, what is key also, that with Nephio, we are able to automatically define the network attachment definition. And I can tell you that something that is very hard in the real deployment. For me, it brings a lot of value also. So we may also insist on this feature we develop, on Vim and the others developed. I think it's also very important to highlight that.
So I think if you look to the infrastructure side of things, there we made it very, let's say, flexible and customizable. So we took really the approach, like in the beginning, you have a network function, like we said in some of these calls, we define a package by a set of people, right? The vendors, or either it comes from the vendor, it comes from an integrator, or it comes from a set of people that build that package. And in that thing, you can say, okay, I have these interfaces, I need these VLANs or not. and all of these parameters. So there we actually did a very extensive set of, let's say, work that is very flexible and customizable, but it's limited to the infra part, if you see what I'm saying. So when it comes down to 3GPP parameters, just to make it black and white, there we didn't do that. You see?
Perfect. I think I've seen a very good note on the comment section. The document created by Balaji, I think it's shared here. And it's basically the same story, Wim, that you are actually helping us understand. We could take a look at that document as well, just to go through that and make sure that we have everything correctly understood about R1. So it's similar. I think this is the document, the one that Balaji's link shared.
Yeah. Okay.
Here.
Well, we'll go through that. But yeah, so that's probably the good base.
Sounds good.
If it's not complete, we should probably extend that one rather than starting something new. Yeah.
Correct. Correct. We'll just take that document and insert here, which is basically a little bit more detailed to these bullet points, which you are helping us understand as well at this time. So configuring the infrastructure, deployment of the
Is PMO admin Bala? Sorry.
No, that's me for some reason. I don't know why, but I had a question, Wim and team, right? So from what I see the document here with the user stories delivered for infra automation, this part, was this something that SIG2 agreed to in terms of the CRDs for cluster LCM and so forth, or was this something I've heard, some of the folks saying this is something that was completed, but it may not have been fully agreed to in the larger community and so forth. It was somewhat quickly put together given the timeline constraints for R1. I just wanted to quickly pulse check with the team.
Yeah, so just to be clear, I think that's true for everything to a certain extent, especially, but I do agree for this one. Here, I would say, if you look, my 2 cents here is this, right? So we achieved a cluster creation dynamically, but we took some, let's say, easy approach in the sense that first of all, we standardized on cluster API. We didn't build an abstraction on top of it. So we basically took the raw cluster API artifacts that they provide, right? And we used the constructs that John in its package management delivered. So we used PVS and PVs and all of that stuff. We create secrets to access them. So there's a bunch of stuff that has happened. I think it's a good starting point. Is it complete? In my view, no, but it's a good starting point that we could potentially build upon.
And for cluster infra, the one CLD that we need to fix on is the cluster context. So that one,
correct. So 100%. Yeah. So basically,
go for it.
No, at the moment, cluster context is no longer used, by the way, Stephen. So it's now workload. I think the CRD is workload cluster, right? So we moved all of that to workload cluster. But what is clear is that there is a set of, so first of all, there is a set of parameters that also here we hard-coded, if you will. I mean, not true hard-coded, but a little bit. So for example, we say, let's say without having, and I think that goes to the comment that Alexis was made, and I think or some other people have made as well, is that today we don't have a feedback loop from the workload cluster to the management cluster somehow. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is that in that CRD, for example, we say this cluster is capable of SRIOV, MAC VLAN, and IP VLAN, and so which is hard-coded. Which is actually true because it's a provision-based parameter, but there is no check whether that is correct or not, right? So it's basically, it's provisioned in that CRD, and that is then being used all over the place, and there is also no feedback and stuff like that. So there is definitely an area of improvement in that space, from my point of view, that we should look at. Also potentially to look at other, let's say, cluster management solutions. So we just used cluster API because one, it supports kind clusters, which is what we are using at the moment for the most part. And then, Victor helped us to figure out how to make that happen. And then we put a wrapper around it that Nefio is used in other areas. But that's kind of what happened in a nutshell. So by far it is complete, but it's it's also not complete throwaway in my view, but it's definitely worth looking at that to be extended and so on. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I have a very high level question. Wim and Tal, you guys are here, maybe to brainstorm with you. So do we have enough potential in the free 5GC existing 5G core to basically come up with our additional augmented requirements for R2, or should we consider using production grade network function for SMF UPF and then build the R2 requirements for that? Or would be too much for R2 to be done at once? Because you will start with fresh CRDs and a fresh deployment effort and then be able to extend. I want to see if there is room in the free 5GC as a network function capabilities to be able to build full R2 requirements on top of it.
I think for me, it really depends on which lifecycle operations we are targeting, right? And whether or not they are able to accomplish them. For example, I think Tal was already saying, there is no, let's say, dynamic way to provide a new configuration. So let's say you want to add a slice, you cannot do that at the moment. From my understanding, I'm not sure whether it's correct, but that's my let's say assumption on free 5GC capability.
Yeah, so the slice affects SMF and you have to reboot SMF to take that new config.
Yeah.
Sana, if I may, right, I was thinking of a different way to structure, right? Let's agree on the key themes. Let's then break those down into key functional or performance requirements. And then the choice of either network functions, the vendors, the choice of tools, all of those will hopefully fall out from there, right? Now, it may not be as black and white, but I think maybe let's agree on the key themes that we need to address first and then break down from there.
I agree, Kaushik. I was just throwing this question for like background information, but let's go through the process you're recommending. I'm good with this.
So what I did was I somewhat baselining from everyone's inputs. I started a document for all of our collective, as a diary or a notepad of sorts, right? We could maybe use that for live editing, or we could maybe, Sana, if you had, I think this document also had a requirement section, but I don't see it. I say it's pretty thin.
It's just started. Yeah. So we can go to your document, Kaushik, and if needed, we'll merge them at the end. So let's share your document.
Perfect. So this was, I literally put this today and I say bunch of comments, which I'm still going through. But again, this is all of our collective focus areas, right? So this is all background. The themes that I thought, and this is what I suggest we discuss today, right? Which is, let's agree on the specifics. We can come back to those, right? But the themes, I'll just quickly recap and I'll open it up. Define the NEFIO architecture and integration with telco automation systems. I think this is something that SIG1 working group 1 has been talking about. This needs to be a key delivery, right? And this includes coexistence with rest of the telco automation systems, usage of cross integration with brownfield, and using existing OSS tools and so forth, right? This, I think we may have to fit it appropriately into a different theme, but this was all of the APIs. APIs here could be CRDs, maybe something else, but everything north-south. North-south will be, let's say, service orchestration or potentially maybe some OSS systems. South would be towards infra or towards network function workloads. East-west, again, we need to, based on the network architecture, it could be some other automation systems that we need to cross integrate with for, let's say, domain automation for transport and so forth, right? As an example.
Sometimes
these are all
question.
Go for it.
Yeah, Kaushik, I was saying that for sometimes performance tools also require that integration for extended lifecycle management. So maybe the east-west could refer to that as well.
Correct. Right. So the key deliverables would be all of these interfaces. I'm using interface to imply CRDs primarily, but if at all we need imperative APIs for brownfield cross integration and so forth, those are all in scope. So we should towards, at least for SO, MSO, for infra and NF provisioning, as well as for configuration of the network function, we should define the CRs. Potentially there may be more depending on what the network architecture looks like as part of key theme 1. Was Wim, go for it.
Yeah, so a very quick one here is like, do we have example, or I'm now thinking practically to how to do that more. Like, do we have systems that we have access to, and which use cases are we targeting? It's more similar to what we did with Free5GC. We had access to something. Is it similar here? Do we have somewhere implementation that we can get access to, and then the respective use case? Because this is very broad from how I read this.
We'll refine it, Wim. I think it's
Yeah.
just the initial direction that basically Kaushik is proposing. If we do arrive at this direction, so for example, for northbound, we could say, let's stick to this one Etsy API, for example, and let's just implement our CRD that can actually communicate with that Etsy API. And for Etsy specifications, we probably won't need a real system, or we may need a real system for the sake of testing or development. But I think we can get to that once we align ourselves on exactly what is it that we would be delivering for R2.
Yeah,
I don't know if there are open source.
Yeah, I see a few raised hands, but just one thing I want to call out, right? I'm trying to delineate between design versus implementation, right? Some of these themes will be design only scope for R2. Some of these other themes will have both design and implementation. I think, Wim, your question is more for the latter. For the former, I think there is a lot of work that SIG1 primarily has to lead to at least propose a design, right? And then maybe an R3 and so forth might lead to some of the implementation. So how do we demarcate which themes and what specifications do we implement is something that we collectively need to decide.
Sure. I was more talking about the implementation side. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, understood. No, that's a great point. Tal?
Yes, I wanted to talk a little bit about the interfaces. So I don't know if people saw a message I posted on Slack. I'll share a link here. Just a second.
The OAI one, right? Which is almost getting ready.
No, on Slack.
On Slack, I see.
Wanted to suggest something regarding, the north, south, east, west interfaces, right? And showing integration. So it seems to me to be very ambitious to do too. And the reason is that these interfaces, I really think rather, my way of thinking of these things, it's like writing an essay. First you write the content, and when you're done writing the content, then you write the introduction. Before we really define our interfaces, I think we need to know what the content is. So my suggestion, at least at this early stage of the project, and I think we're still at early enough stage, that we focus on the actual integrations and examples of integrations to learn as a community before we actually define those interfaces. Examples, policy framework. Examples, Tosca and service orchestration, right? Example, Helm as a southbound interface, right? We've already had discussions on these topics, but being able for R2 to actually define those interfaces, I think is overly ambitious and could be self-defeating too, because it will limit right now what we'll be able to do when we don't actually know quite how to do these things. So my suggestion instead was actually to start in R2 with examples. And rather than define the interfaces, hope that in the future, the interfaces will emerge from our experience with these examples, if that makes sense.
Right. It completely makes sense. I think what we were trying to accomplish in the document that Kaushik is sharing is to build a North Star story so that we can all brainstorm on where do we need to arrive. So basically you and Wim both are looking at the implementation level details. We have to extract from this document exactly what is it that we want to do in R2. So this is still at the very high level, like a brainstorming North Star alignment, where what is it that where do we want to go with all these requirements? And I completely agree. How we get to interfaces is basically what we need to discover. And you proposed something really good, that we should start with experiments with integrations, and that will lead to interfaces eventually for us. And the more integrations, we'll be more generic in how do we define those interfaces eventually. And API could be the last step of that, where we know exactly how generic it could get.
Yeah, and maybe for the broader group, I would also state maybe the themes, the wording might confuse people. What I'm trying to bucketize are the key deliverables is something that we need to agree to, the point that Sana is making. So for example, for this theme, maybe this one we should debate, but these two themes are based on the real work that I feel we should be carrying forward, right? Which is, let's say we pick a second NF vendor, maybe we'll bring a real infra automation with some, real infra vendor. All of these will be in line with that, right? So while the theme will carry forward beyond R2, the deliverables is what we need to agree on, right? So maybe let's, if you don't mind, can I just run through the themes where let's first agree on what themes are missing, which themes are important and so forth. And then we go one level deeper in terms of how do we focus the energies. Also, because to the point that Tal you're making, I would recommend this group to target R2. Of course, it's a broader discussion beyond SIG1, but I would recommend targeting SIG2 sometime in mid-November. Anything beyond that, given organic delays and so forth. So we've got about 3.5, 4 months in front of us. So we should plan accordingly and not go too broad.
Yeah, because Kostas, maybe just quick. I mean, what I'm seeing here in this document, some of these deliverables are requested by SIG2. Some of them are requested by SIG1. I think is that fair to? Is that a fair assumption?
I think for now, this is more like a brain dump based on both my understanding of inputs from all of all the inputs within SIG1 that were presented, as well as some of the offline inputs that I'm hearing. This was my educated guess as trying to put a snapshot or a placeholder, right? But this is really open for all of us to discuss and agree on.
Sure. Okay.
Right. Wim, this is the summary of our requirements gathering sessions that we have had in SIG1 over last couple of months, basically. If you look at the requirements document, most of these questions and the feedback came from service providers actually participating in SIG1. And of course, the expansion of the document, like Kaushik mentioned, is open for automation SIG to basically provide your inputs to.
Okay.
Yeah. So, I see Alok and others. Alok?
I think Kiran was first. And
oh, I see. It's hard to
Actually,
look at
Bernard was first, but he dropped his hand.
yeah, I think
thought we
Bernard
wanted to
was
go quickly through the themes. So Kaushik was mentioning that he wanted to quickly go through the themes then before going into the deeper details.
If that's okay for the group, because otherwise we might go a little bit too deep right away.
Yeah, I had a comment on something Charles said earlier, but I don't think it's you can carry on with the flow of the meeting unless Alok has something to.
I just posted my opinion in the chat here. We can take it offline as well. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I think, Alok, that's a good point. So again, the first two are primarily for high-level network architecture and some of the more specific definitions of interfaces based on the work that we will prioritize in R2. Third one is operator STK, which is, again, this is an ongoing theme, but I think this is something that some of us have been discussing in terms of how do we simplify and make it easy to have a common set of capabilities to make it easy for vendors to onboard onto Nephew, right? Most of the vendors today don't write Kubernetes operators. So how would Nephew make their life simpler? These will include working very closely with the vendors to understand the requirements, then prioritizing the work, and then scoping it to R2. But this, in my opinion, this would be a key theme to carry forward, starting with R2. The fourth is, again, a broad bucket theme. This is to the point that some of us were discussing. R1 was simplistic. It did some basic day 1 and day 2, but not the meaningful set of things. It also didn't have day 0. It didn't do, it was a stretch goal to do cluster LCM. It did something as an example. So this is about showcasing all the capabilities for all the automation lanes. So cluster LCM, all the layers of the telco stack, as well as for day 0 to N scenarios. How do we pick which scenarios? How do we prioritize is something that we need to figure out. But at least my thinking was, if we could handpick the scenarios in a way that at the end of R2, we showcase all of day 0 to N for all of the layers, even if it's one scenario at a time, I think that's a very good proof in the pudding for all of us. This is something that again we need to discuss in terms of, do we continue with free 5GC and all, but the meta point was we should design both the CRDs as well as the implementation for at least 2 NF vendors. Ideally a production grade vendor, but if not, maybe an OAI or maybe someone else as an example. We should also maybe discuss here about infra vendor. I didn't explicitly call it out. Ideally, an infra vendor would also help, given the focus on infra automation. But that was, expanding the scope to more than one vendor. Ideally, both NF and infra, but we should pick and prioritize. This one, I think I merged it, Eric, with the bullet number 4. So those were the few themes that I propose. It's not that I propose, but I put it out there for everyone's inputs and thoughts. And then I put some deliverable themes as well, but this is not really fleshed out. So maybe this is where we will open it up and request everyone's inputs. Do the themes resonate and how? Yeah.
Yeah. So, sorry, finish your thought first. I wanted to propose something in the themes.
Yeah, no. So I think the key thing is, do the themes resonate with people? What themes are missing? What themes do need updates? And if there is anything that we don't think is reasonable, again, maybe somewhat not getting too much stuck on the timelines and implementation details right in this meeting. Let's just agree on the broader thematic first. Go ahead, Sana.
Right. Kaushik, generally when we work with the products for service orchestration, like with a lot of vendors, I've been working with these products for some time. I generally dissect the evolution of the product and its maturity in 2 or 3 swim lanes. So one of the swim lanes is the infrastructure or the product itself, how mature the product is getting, which includes things like your UI or your design on how the product's interface is going to look like, and how is your experience actually going from your inception, your intent, basically that's my network function. These are the artifacts. Here I store them, here I package them. And how is the tool walking me through in interacting with the artifacts and their repos and deploying them. That experience, how well the UIs are defined to make me use the developed artifacts and the automations to deploy them to different type of infrastructures. So basically the product's UIs itself makes one of the swim lanes on how the product is getting more mature and how the APIs are accessible or exposed for us to consume those capabilities. So that's the platform level features. Now, one of the swim lanes is basically the integration capabilities, which you talked about, the north, south, east, west APIs, right? Eventually, the goal that we have. How well the new product can actually integrate with our existing systems. And the only measure for that is APIs. Say we receive a ready product from one of the vendors, we can only say that the product can actually integrate with the rest of the ecosystem if that has well-documented APIs for us to interconnect with the rest of the world. So maybe that's another criteria for us to identify how well and how soon can we consume this product into our system. And the third one is, of course, our ability to derive the user stories, the use cases that we can drive on it. So what kind of plugins or SDKs or templates are pre-available into that product that we can consume off the shelf? So for example, if I am to use Nephew as a product today, what is it that I can do with Nephew today? I would say that for the library, I have the free 5GC CRDs and some operators and some artifacts already developed, which could actually guide my way for deploying, for example, another 5G network function. And I think overall your themes have captured all these 3 swim lanes. How the product is evolving in terms of its features, the user stories, how they're evolving for us to be able to consume for other network functions, for other flavors of infrastructures and things like that. And one thing, Kaushik, that I feel is maybe not directly captured is the user experience. How we are evolving in Nephew to develop an experience for us, going from a web-based UI to eventually something that is more sophisticated down the lane.
Yeah, that's a good point, Sana. We should more explicitly track user experience as a independent theme in itself. Although it is related to every implementation, but yes.
Correct. correct, which could constantly like mature. Like in the beginning, we might be using CLI or maybe a lot of manual work, but eventually it could be more sophisticated.
But maybe just to jump the line, sorry, if I may, it's also, I think, the roles and responsibilities and who does what to make this thing work, right? So I think that's also important. So it's the UX experience, but also the who we are expecting to do what to achieve this automation. And then
right.
how?
Wim, we did this exercise in one of the SIG1 documents. When we were dissecting the user stories for R1, I think Kaushik and we worked on this exercise of actors and users, and we had a lot of disconnect on how various organizations are actually, like the process was very different across the organizations, where sometimes an actor in one organization is a vendor for the same role. In another organization, that was a service owner team, for another it was a cloud team. So some of those things we did that exercise, which was very interesting, but there wasn't a lot of synergy in how various organizations are actually attempting to deploy a network functions from start to end. We can do this again for R2.
Wait, so what I'm suggesting is a bit different, Sana, is we walk you through what the roles are that are, because see, what we've done in release 1 at the moment, right? And sorry to jump the line, but I had another question, but I wanted to address this. Is there is in order to do the setup of R1, we build a bunch of scripts, right? And those scripts, they do stuff that in a real life would happen through a human or a process or what have you, right? So I believe it's worth to have a look at that from a, let's say an operator point of view, to see whether those elements that we are using and consuming are realistic and are covering a good basis of that roles and responsibility team. You see what I'm saying? So I would reverse it, that we show you how release 1 operates or what the hooks are, and then you could provide feedback or say, no, this has to be done differently, because that, I remember we had this discussion on Helm in the TSC, right? I mean, for me, it's not so much about Helm or KRM or something like that. It is actually how we decompose and which, let's say, elements we provide access to, or we expect certain people to act upon based on the information that we are requiring. You see what I'm saying?
Right. Wim, if you want to do that, maybe in one of our next working sessions, we can spend some time, like 5-10 minutes, to see how you guys actually, how is the user experience or the roles and responsibilities tackled in R1 deployment. I would like to see what you guys have thought so far, and if that's different than how we would want that to be, for example, from Orange or DT or Telus, we have had our own perceptions on how we want the roles and responsibilities to be operating. We can give you our feedback, and maybe that would be a good discussion.
Yes. Okay.
Kaushik, should we go to the raised hand? Are you finishing?
Yeah, I'm done. Sandeep?
Yeah, on the themes line, are we going to target anything like the closed loop automations based on the network functions KPIs values? Or is it possible? Because right now what I see is based on the 35GC, we don't have anything related to that. Like I know that 35GC doesn't expose any interface to query the KPIs. So is it going to be a theme, the closed loop automation based on the network function KPI for the R2 or beyond?
I think Kaushik has captured the day 2 operations in theme number 7, or maybe in the lifecycle management in theme number 4. He has implicitly captured some of the day 2 plus management of the application as well as infrastructure. Kaushik, this lifecycle management, how do we distinguish between 7 and 4?
Sorry, what is 7 and 4? Oh, 7,
Yeah.
I moved it into 4. So I think we should.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I see it's 4 now. It is 4 now.
Yeah. But then I think this is again my view, Sandeep. What you said, closed loop automation can mean many things. But if you're looking at, like if you have specific examples, we could discuss. My sense is R2 will be a little bit stretched to build to what you're saying. I think our focus should be to the point that Tal was making earlier. We should be a little bit more inwards and compact in terms of the focus areas. If we just build the basics, then I think delivering in terms of the features, like you're saying, closed loop automation might be an R3 and forward-looking scope. But that's again my view. I think we should really debate in terms of what is it that what you describe as closed loop.
Yeah, for example, what we was initially saying about the scale operations, the scale in, scale out operations, right? So based on what parameters are we scaling in and scaling out right now? So that is what I'm trying to say, is that there could be a dynamic things coming from, like, for example, let's say we define intent, right? For example, we have so many functions available, right? AMF, all those things, right? So for example, we can say UPF is there. So what is the throughput? What is the latency? And all those things are the KPIs. So if we are able to dynamically query them and match them with the intent, what is defined by the user, and then we take some actions based on that. So that could consist of the whole closed loop kind of a scenario, right? Right now I see scale out based on just increasing the CPU and some sort of a RAM and all those things, right? So I was thinking about those scenarios.
If I may jump in the UPF and SMF implementation right now, based on free 5GC, UPF does based on throughput and uplink, downlink, I think, if I remember correctly, and correlate that to CPU and RAM availability or allocation. And the same with SMF. In fact, I coded that.
Yeah, I think Sandeep's point is we should we can configure them, but then we're not reading the throughput information from free 5GC, which is
yeah. If I may finish,
uh-huh.
The implementation is very basic because free 5GC exposure is limited, but we had also started talking about, and I hesitate to use the next word because it's loaded, some sort of policy to allow the user during runtime as well as configuration time to implement rules on those. And if there are more variable parameters that we need to take care of, I don't think free 5GC exposed that. So if we want to do what Sandeep is proposing, we need to explore additional vendor NF that allow that kind of capability.
Yeah, I kind of agree with that, because we also explored a little bit on the free 5GC and we didn't find any interfaces to hook onto that to find what are the KPIs values. So yeah, I agree.
By the way, I think Bernard's next.
Thank you. So I would have, in addition, two things which I would love to see. First of all, in the theme for number 2, I would like to see something related to service assurance. That means we've got a lot of information regarding the architecture of what has been deployed and which can be derived out of this configuration process. So I'd love to see how we would reflect that, potentially reflect that towards service assurance systems. Again, I'm not discussing about North Star timeline or R2 timeline, just sort of to not have it be forgotten. One thing, if that's okay, I'm not quite sure, I'm open for discussion, but I'd love to see something, because in the end, we always want to see if it works. So in this sense, would be great if we could have sort of a service assurance interface also listed here.
Yeah. Hey,
And the
Bernard.
second,
Yeah. Sorry. Do you want me to respond, or you want to discuss through
please.
your second? So one thing that we should maybe delineate, which is the design versus implementation, right? I think the high level network architecture and so forth, I'm with you, right? We should discuss and debate everything, including service assurance and so forth. When it comes to implementation and let's say designing designing the interfaces in abstract may not be a good idea, to the point that Tal was making. So if we know the specific user journeys, we know the implementation scope, then defining the CRDs or the interfaces makes a lot of sense. So I think from that vantage point, I don't yet know whether we'll be able to fit in service assurance interface description. I think we should agree on the high level, demarcation of roles and responsibilities, right? In terms of Nefio versus the rest of the automation systems. I think from a design standpoint, I'm with you. From an implementation, we should discuss and agree on the R2 scope.
Sure, that's fine. The second thing which I'm missing a little bit is the following. If you imagine that we have several vendors providing infrastructure or network functions, they can make our lives very complicated when we have to define the packages and the integration of those different tools if their CRDs are very difficult to understand. So I was just wondering if, sort of as a part of these roles and responsibilities discussion, we could also highlight a little bit sort of some kind of best practices which we would recommend when creating or structuring CRDs and defining what operators can actually do. Otherwise, it'll always be a very tedious integration task to see how parameter A from one resource matches to a set of parameters in other resources, and will basically be a sort of a task requiring a lot of integration experts to cover that.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, Bernard, and that's something that I know you've historically also spoken about, both in terms of schemas and so forth for the CRDs, but also not just maybe a best practices guide, but even potentially maybe this is somewhat overflowing into the operator SDK kind of a thing. Maybe even a way to make it easy for people to follow those best practices, right? So that they don't have to really. It's not a documentation, maybe it's code, right, through the operator SDK. And I think that is what you're describing.
Yes.
If I may respond to that, in SIG automation during R1, and Stephen and Vim can correct me if I'm wrong, but we did touch upon, the workload packages dealing with specific NF, right, vendor NF. And we talk about furtherly specializing those into for different vendors. And that was an approach that, obviously we didn't implement because we had only one vendor, so to speak, free 5GC. But we had started touching upon those, the mapping between the general package into specialized workload packages. I don't know if that's sufficient, because I would imagine that, quote unquote, a real network function from a vendor and, an operational one would be a lot more complicated than free 5GC, and the level of specialization to support that, extension, so to speak, that we had agreed that would be up to the vendor, not to Nefio, because there's no way Nefio can have that kind of expertise and implementation. So I want to bring that up here to see if the network function vendor represented here would agree with that perspective.
So I think, yeah, I mean, I can respond if you want from a network vendor. I think, so that goes back to my my initial point is that we focus mainly on the infra part at the moment, right? So what you could do, I mean, we could basically leave it as is, right? And say, okay, I mean, at the end of the day, we have built, you could say, a generic CRD that is vendor agnostic, right? And then the vendor should consume it, right? So that's one thing. Of course, right now, there is no 3GPP parameter or whatsoever in that space, right? Which means that you are constrained or you're limited to the infra part at the moment, okay? What you could go a step further to say those infra part, you actually could build an SDK that a vendor has to then integrate rather than he figuring it out, right? And to ease that part of the integration. You could do that for, I think, for the infra component. You could do the same if you have the other elements covered. You could do the same in that space. But so that's one option that I personally see. There, yeah. And there is, I see from multi-vendor integration, I see two potential options because I think that also happened very, let's say, quickly. But at the end, when we were onboarding UE Ransom, right, we thought initially we take the package and we deploy. But it turned out that we had to, the parameter for UE Ransom had to align with the rest of the infrastructure, right? So what we did is rather than building a full-blown operator, I actually built a function in specialization that actually does the same as what an operator does on the workload cluster. And the result of that is actually a deployment spec that is then sent to the workload cluster and just deploys it, right? There is other, what I'm trying to say or get to here is there is various or different approaches to multi-vendor integration potentially.
Agree. I guess my
And
question
so
really, sorry, go ahead.
It's worth flushing out towards Bernard's point, what are the best practice or pros and cons of different approaches on how to do that. I think that's worth a conversation and maybe a documentation on how we do that. And maybe we can have, let's say, we actually already have two example implementation on how that could be achieved.
Yes, agree.
It would be highly appreciated from our side. I just want to mention that sort of if we don't have these standards, Sana was also mentioning sort of documenting configuration options, etc. If we don't have that, every time we do the onboarding, we have to bring together many, many different experts from different areas trying to align on sort of what sort of this team has been doing in the R1 release. And this effort is tremendous. Yeah, and we have to bring it into production. So this would definitely help us simplify our lives if we could have sort of some kind of simplifications regarding the integration efforts, which have been encountered also when setting up the R1 release, which has been shown so nicely.
Yeah, I think what I was after was, like Vim said, a definition of different approaches. And what I was even more hoping for is the vendor, like Nokia, Vim, and Bernard. I forgot which vendor you're in.
No, I'm
can
from
tell
TT.
us. TT, sorry, no, telco. Which approach you prefer given the current deployment, operational in the field, so that we have a more practical approach. Pick a practical approach to follow. Not that we will exclude the other, but given 2-3 approaches, which one do we start first? That's all. Thanks.
Yeah, I think from an Ericsson perspective, I think I can agree with them that there is a number of different options, and I think we need to work through those over the next period of time. So looking forward to be part of that process, but it's not something I think we can definitively answer now.
Yeah, there is a lot of fragmentation basically at the infrastructure, vendors, choices, and then a lot of network functions. Even in the 5GC context, if you see, there are lots of vendors, and for each deployment, there will be some differences in how we accomplish the things that we have accomplished for free 5GC. So I'm hoping that what we are doing with Nephew, I think we're at a very early stage right now, but as we are building on our automation and making it a firm approaches, we are gradually getting to a stage where we will have some generic, some things common that could be adopted to other variants of our infrastructure layers or the network function layers. Then we would have a reference model created out of this free 5GC. I think it's a very, very involved discussion. There is a lot of fragmentation in the industry where we are working in right now at the moment, and that's one of the biggest challenges of automation, on how we derive simplicity out of it. I think one of the unsaid North Stars for Nephew is to simplify a lot of that fragmentation and come up with that unified model that we could follow from this community. I think what I said actually froze everybody with questions.
Actually, Tal has been adding comments on the chat, and I love to hear some of the debate in that chat brought up and discussed if possible, especially on the life cycle. And the other thing I like to hear from whoever proposed it, I forgot, sorry, is the definition of service assurance. Because in my head, to do service assurance, you have to have services, you know, and right now we don't have northbound service integration. So how do we do service assurance? Or is that interpretation incorrect?
The interpretation is extremely valid. I think I have been following some of that discussion on the chat for the lifecycle management. And as we have discussed the subject quite a few times, there are many layers of the lifecycle management across infrastructure, across network function, across the network function application layer, where we look at the services. And they're all extremely important and a part of our automation scope. That's a very fundamental reason why we should be using Nephew-like models for those. But I think we are at the stage of deployment and configuration, and the lifecycle management would follow on this, like what we have accomplished in R1. So if anyone has any more questions, comments for that subject, you guys can bring it up and we can discuss. We're already over, but we can wrap up on that if we can.
I think Alexis has his hand raised.
Yes, thank you, Anne. Thank you, Sana, for the comments. My point about service assurance, it's a broad topic, and my goal is not to talk about the services themselves, but rather to start with talk about observability. You can't do service assurance without the metrics. So I don't think we have at any point in time discussed what observability means in the context of Nephew. And so that's where my comment is coming from. Start defining a little bit, because we said this is what we're discussing now is more the vision, the dream. So defining some of the, at least, pillars of service assurance for Nephew, and where I would like the focus to be in R2 is observability, that I think is one of the pillars for service assurance.
It's a very, very fundamental. Yep, Alex, finish first. I had a response for that.
No, but I was just explaining at least the comment I left on the chat, and so my focus is not so much on service to start with, but more the observability portion that the platform we have provides.
Perfect. So Alex, if any automation system cannot come up with its own brain to basically perform the lifecycle management for you, unless the application itself has the capability to expose its analytics in a model that are consumable by something like Nephew. So I think in the beginning of Nephew's launch, myself and Kaushik has published a blog on the 12 factors of CNFs. And one of the big parts of those 12 factors was the observability factor of the network functions. So I don't know how the free 5GC's analytics or observability is it in Prometheus? Is it very cloud native, or is it in some hidden tools? So a big problem in the telco CNFs today is that a lot of that observability is not even accessible to the Kubernetes world. It's sometimes very masked and hidden into the traditional EMSs and those kind of systems. How would Nephew eventually be able to interact with those and be able to perform lifecycle management capabilities at the applications and service assurance layer? Is when those basically products would evolve to become very cloud native in observability. You come from the RAN world, you know exactly what we are talking about. So I think it's something that the network functions would have to enable for Nephew to be able to consume. Maybe we can experiment with 3.5GC, maybe there are opportunities, but how do we embrace that for other telco grade network functions in production? It's something very, very interesting for me to explore.
If I may respond really quickly, one of the possibility is to obtain metrics or even lower level counter from the hardware itself that are being dedicated to the network functions. And coming from a former life where data processing units are very popular, I was at Marvell, that was what we were selling. There was discussion and implementation in OPI to use OTel to obtain those counters and metrics and then bubble that up. So it's not a direct way going through the network functions, but indirectly observing the resources or the metrics that they're consuming through a side channel, so to speak. And that information does a very well published architecture that people use a lot, where the OTel collectors would collect that from different OTel agents sitting on the data processing unit to collect the metrics, and then either push it into a Postgres time series database or open it up, make it available in real time via some sort of API. So that kind of implementation and approach can be done, but it is dependent on the availability of the hardware and its ability to accept OTel agent. So that's one approach.
And we do this already. We do this already in our production. So every time we deploy a network function, we have full control and visibility into the infrastructure metrics, because infrastructure in general is more advanced and cloud native as compared to the individual network functions, because it's new. The cloud came in new. Network functions evolved from the PNFs, and some of their observability tools are still not compliant to the cloud native practices. Even then, the infrastructure metrics alone is not sufficient for us to develop our sophisticated policies that reflects the application level behavior, that would reflect the service level latency and requirements. So that's one thing that we are still already using, which we could adopt for Nephew immediate developments as well. But I think in the longer run, the application level data, which comes from the application itself, is also very useful for the service level policy and management, which is a big theme for network slicing as well, if you are working on that space, which stays a problem at the moment.
Quick question, is the application observability open to be consumed, or is it still very proprietary and closed? In general, in your opinion, in your observation? From the vendors' perspective, the vendors' products today, most of the vendors' products are coming in tools, and they provide certain interfaces for other tools to communicate, but all of those interfaces are very old school, like SNMP based, and some of those tooling is not really friendly to comply with the cloud native practices. Like, for example, they would not have some analytics data stored in Prometheus for Kubernetes to be able to access that freely and be able to consume that. So the world of analytics and KPI at the services layer still needs a lot of transformation for a cloud native world to consume and be able to react to with the policies that we are talking about.
But Sana, just
it's my experience.
To react on this comment, for example, I mean, I personally built a mediator from SNMP to OTel. Right? So it's very easy to, it's not rocket science, by the way, but I do agree I typically the vendors at the moment, including ourselves, we have our own systems that consume it, but I was putting into the chat, there is so I did the prototype at some point where basically I took the vendor specific implementation and I mediated it to a cloud native, let's say, observability system, right? In this case, it was Prometheus and OTel, right? But it could be something else, right? But so this is something that you could do. So towards Alex's point, right? what we could do is say, okay, here is like, and we had that with Watcher Agent. So this was the first start where you basically say, okay, we need to have, let's say, we need to collect data from the workload cluster or from network functions or whatever. And I do agree that there will be specific implementation of specific vendors, but that doesn't prevent us from having that generic interface that we could use. And then, of course, it's the same as with the configuration side, but then the opposite is that you build a plugin for the vendor-specific metrics that would be then consumed to such a system, if you see what I'm saying. And for example, you could, for example, build a sidecar container that does that mediation as an approach, right? I'm not saying that that is the approach, but that could be an approach. Or you build a mediator system that basically collects the metrics in a generic way and then does the mediation towards something like that, right? So these are potential approaches. I'm not saying these are the right ones, but these could be things that you can do.
Really quickly,
It's a
is
very
that
good idea, Wim.
mediator? Sorry, is that mediator available publicly?
Let me check. I
SNMP?
can, if not, I probably will open source it because it's kind of a piece of, yeah, it's very easy.
Yeah, it will be great example code. Thank you.
Hey, if I may jump the queue, sorry to break the discussion, but I think people are also dropping. Maybe do we want to quickly discuss the logistics, a few of the SIG1 logistics as well as the R2 next steps?
Yes, Kaushik, let's do that.
Yeah, so and of course I'll drop out, but then you can continue, please continue the discussion, right? So in terms of R2 scope, what I'll do is I'll share this. I've shared this with the SIG1 group. I will also share this with edit permissions to SIG2. My request is everyone, please keep adding both, not just your comments, but maybe at the bottom of the doc, please propose specific either user stories or design themes and so forth, right? So that we can be crisp about it. That's request number one. But maybe separately, Sana, we should have a working group focused on R2 within SIG1, which I know we had talked about last time we couldn't meet. Do we want to schedule it moving forward every Thursday, starting this week, Thursday, 9 a.m. PT? Is that reasonable for the group?
I'm good with that, Kaushik.
Right. So I will then go ahead and schedule that, and then we can, let's spend the next 2-3 days ironing out and refining on this document. And then maybe in that working group session, we'll further discuss that in a smaller forum.
Sounds good, Kaushik. And everybody who had comments in the chat section, if you have a specific user story that you would want to basically be considered for R2, put that in the R2 user story section.
Yeah, and then lastly, I suggest we had discussed this a few weeks ago, but we didn't really execute. We should move this SIG1 to a weekly meeting until we really close the loop on at least some of these action items.
So Kaushik, you mean there'll be 2 meetings every week, Monday and Thursday? Because
I
we will
would
be using, yeah.
Correct. And the Thursday meeting will be a little bit more specific with a smaller set of folks, and we'll go one level deeper.
Okay. I'm good with that, Kaushik. Until we have produced the R2 requirements, I'm good with the weekly SIG1 every Monday and also the Thursday meeting.
Perfect. Sounds like a plan. I will schedule it again. We can reduce the frequency back to bi-weekly once we close the loop on R2.
Perfect.
Okay. Hey, I need to drop, unfortunately, but please do continue the discussion. It was a great discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. I have to drop for other meetings too. We will continue the discussion on Thursdays and Mondays, but if people have time here and they want to chat, the bridge will stay open.
Well, in terms of continuing chatting, Sana, you did mention the put in a use case in the document. I think Alexis raised the use case potentially of service assurance. I think he dropped already, but I think that's something that we could start specifying. A limited version of service assurance, of course, something that could be achievable. And we can build on later, eventually reaching a complete closed loop, right? So I don't know who would want to take that. Oh yeah, she did drop. Well, I'll reach out to Alexei separately and see if he's willing maybe to take the lead on that and maybe start to sketch something out.
Yeah. Ravi, Suhash, didn't you guys have your hand up?
Oh, well, the chair's left, so I wasn't sure.
Okay.
Yeah, I think everybody's
critical.
so.
Yeah, I will probably insert my comments.
Yeah, probably update the doc would be, comment on the doc.
Yeah, I'll do that.
Yeah, I had actually this question on the observability, so that I wanted to discuss. So if it's okay, I'll throw the question here. Otherwise, we'll go to the chat.
Yeah, we can continue on Slack, I think.
Okay.
You know what? I think I'm actually, let me know, you guys, if you think this is a good idea to create a new discussion channel on chat for observability. Maybe to focus the discussion there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, right. Yes.
Yeah.
I'll do that. Worst case, people don't use it. Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye for now.
Thank you.
I think Vim would be able to stop the recording. I don't think any of us logged in as PMO admin.
Yeah, I will stop the recording.
Okay, thank you.